everybody. I hope you all have had a chance to enjoy some of this warm spring weather that we've been having. We've been talking about humility and putting others first by giving up what we want or what we think we deserve. Being humble is important, but it is tough. There's going to be lots of times in life when we have to make a decision to decide whether we're going to dig in so we get our way or we're going to let it go for the sake of others. While that's tough, we can remember Jesus and how he showed humility, because the way he treated other people really turned the world upside down. Now, before we start going into our lesson today, I wanted to play a game with you guys called Sink or Float. I'm sure you are familiar with this. It's very simple. I'm going to show you different objects, and you're going to decide if you think it's going to sink or if it's going to float. And if you have a scratch piece of paper and pencil, to grab that real quick, because if you get your guess right, just give yourself a tally mark. So let's get started. We'll start off with something simple. I have a heart, it is a heart-shaped rock. I have this. Let's see if it's going to sink or float. Make your guess, sink or float. And it sinks. All right, let's try something else. We've got a pencil. Do you think this is going to sink or float? Ready? And the pencil floats. All right, I've got now a paper clip and a rubber band. Do you think they will sink or float? Let's do the paper clip first. Sink or float? It sinks. Now what about the rubber band? That also sinks. I thought the rubber band was gonna float. All right, we have two cars. I have a metal car and a plastic one. Let's see what they do. The metal one first, sink or float? Sinks. What about the plastic one, sink or float? Ooh, that sinks as well. I thought that one would float. All right, and let's do the baseball and the marble ball. We'll do the baseball first, sink or float? Ooh. That floats. And the marble, sink or float? And that one sinks. All right, we also have a shell. Will it sink or float? Sinks. That makes sense. We find shells at the bottom of the ocean. All right, now I've got two different kinds of eggs. I have just a regular egg, and I have a hard-boiled egg where the shell is taken off. So we'll do the regular egg first, sink or float? Sinks. And what about the hard-boiled egg? That sinks as well. All right, let's do the last one. I have two oranges, one with the peel off and one with the peel on. Let's do the one with the peel off first. Sink or float? And that sinks. And the one with the peel on, sink or float? And that one floats. Right. This is something that you can do at home too. Just find different objects around your house and test it out. See if they sink or float. Now I have a couple of questions for you about this little game. The first one is, how sure were you about your guesses when you're going into it? Were you really confident about what your guess was going to be? I know for some of them I was. Now, my next question is, how many of your guesses did you get right? Did you get them all right or some of them wrong? I bet you got at least one wrong, or maybe was at least surprised by one of them. And that leads to my next question. How did it feel to get, if you got the answer wrong? How did that make you feel? For some of you, you may have been no big deal or surprised. Maybe some of you were mad or frustrated that you got it wrong. Or maybe you even suggested that maybe I was playing a trick on you of some sort. It's hard to admit when we're wrong, and it's hard to admit that we don't always have all the answers. And you know, the Bible talks specifically about this. And we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. And it says this, "In the same way I'm speaking to you who are younger. Follow the lead of those who are older. All of you put on a spirit free of pride toward one another. Put humility on as if it were clothes. Do this because scriptures say, God opposes those who are proud, but gives grace to those who are humble." Now, learning something new or possibly being wrong about something is hard, but having humility can help us have a growth mindset, which means we have an openness to learn and to grow. And that's especially important when it comes to God. And I want to share with you a time when Jesus' disciples started to get a better idea of just how big God's plans really were. And they started to realize that they had much more to learn about Jesus and his love for all of us. You see, the disciples, they thought the story had ended, that it was finished when Jesus died on the cross. But little did they know how big God's plan really was. So we're going to turn now to Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. And we're going to pick up in God's big story on that first Easter when Mary had gone to the tomb and saw that the tomb was empty. She'd seen that it was empty and she saw Jesus there. So she ran to go get some of Jesus' disciples. And she got Peter and John and told them everything that had happened and then brought them back to the tomb. And sure enough, Peter and John went inside and saw that the tomb was empty. And the only thing in there were the strips of cloth that Jesus was buried in. You see, 3 days before they had seen their friend die on the cross, and now his body was missing, nowhere to be found. But Jesus was alive. That very same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were traveling to a village about 7 miles away from Jerusalem. And as they were walking and talking, they were just talking about what had gone on in Jerusalem, how Jesus had died on the cross, how there was the empty tomb, and maybe even rumors of the fact that Jesus had come back to life. And as they were walking and talking, a man started walking alongside of them. You know, they thought it was just a random guy who was walking with them, going in the same direction they were going. And this guy, they didn't realize it was Jesus himself. But God had not revealed that to the men yet, that was actually Jesus. So Jesus said to them, he says, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" The men's faces were so sad, and one of them responded by saying, let me find it real quick. "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Basically, they were saying, "Dude, have you been living under a rock? Where have you been? How have you not heard?" And Jesus goes on to say, "What things?" The men went on and they told Jesus all about Jesus. They explained how the chief priests and the rulers had made up lies about Jesus and sentenced him to death. How Jesus was nailed on a cross. They told Jesus the whole story of everything that Jesus himself had done. Then Jesus answered them by saying this, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" Jesus went on to remind them of all the things that the scriptures had laid out about God's plans. How ever since the beginning, God had planned to send a Savior. He went all the way back to Moses and the prophets. And as they got near to the village, Jesus kept on walking and talking, and the men didn't want him to leave. So they asked him if he would stay. And he agreed, and he decided to stay with them, and they decided to sit down and have an evening meal. Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke the bread and gave it to them. And in that moment, the men realized that that was Jesus himself. And in that instant, Jesus disappeared from their sight. Poof, he was gone. They realized that this whole time, it was Jesus all along. No wonder he was able to speak and explain all of the things about God's promises. They got up at once, were going to travel all the way back to Jerusalem to tell the disciples there everything that had happened and everything that they had encountered with Jesus. Jesus' disciples and his followers were starting to get a better idea of just how big God's plan was. It is bigger and it stretches farther and longer than any of us can ever imagine. Just like the disciples, we can't always know the full story of our own lives, but God can. And as we learn more about him, we'll learn to trust him more and more. That's why it's important to have a humbleness that we put on like clothes, like 1 Peter 5:5 said, so that we're open to keep learning and to keep growing in our faith and our understanding of who God is. Sometimes being humble means that you admit you don't have all the answers, or that sometimes we get it wrong, like in our sink or float game. It's a tough thing to admit, but it helps us to realize that we have a lot to learn, especially about God, and that's okay. Jesus helped these men fill in the blanks and connect the dots about God's plan, and he'll help us too. Just like those men, we are never ever done learning. So what does that mean for us now, today, when things are totally different than we've ever known, when there's uncertainty about what the future will look like, and we can't see the full picture or story? Remember that there is always more to discover about God's plan. Use this time to see what you can learn about God and how he can grow you and shape you into the person he created you to be. Ask lots of questions and don't ever stop discovering more about Jesus and his love for you. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of activities that you can do at home to remind you to never ever stop learning, that learning is unending. The first one that you can do is get a bunch of paper clips, however many you have. And what you want to do is you link them together. It's a little bit challenging. You link them together and you keep going and going and going until you make a circle. You can make it really big, you can make it a size of a bracelet or a size of a necklace, or just use all of them and get as big as you can and make it into a circle. And when you see that circle, it can remind you, just like this doesn't have an end, neither does the fact that we have to keep learning about Jesus. That doesn't end either. The other thing you can do is a fun game to play. You can play this with your mom or your dad or a brother or a sister. And what you want to do is called cup up, cup down. So you take cups and you spread them out all through a room. You could do it in your backyard as well. And the goal is one of you is going to be cup up and the other one is going to be cup down. And the goal is you set a timer or a limit and you're going to run around, and if you're cup up, you want to turn all the cups up. But if you're cup down, you want to turn all the cups down. And you'll notice as you're playing this game that this can also go on and on until the timer goes off. And that can also be another reminder to you to keep on learning, to keep on growing, and have a humbleness in your heart as you discover more about God's plan for you and Jesus' love for all of us. All right, guys, have a great week, and I will see you next time.